Hi friends, this is Josh from Narrate. This is the second part of Narrate's series, A Fill-in-the-Blank Person. Adam talked about how Jesus affected the way we think about women.
So if you weren't with us last week, we started the series, and really we just have one agenda for this series, and it's just to move up towards Christmas and consider the historical Jesus. It's not that we don't believe that Jesus was God. It's not that we don't think that Jesus being God and thus Savior and walking out of the tomb alive is an unimportant idea. We think that is profoundly important. But we thought this Christmas, as we head towards Christmas and contemplate this baby that we will celebrate, his birth, that it might do us well to just consider his historical impact, to see what kind of person he was. And so the invitation in this series, though I certainly hope it's not misunderstood, but the invitation is to set aside Jesus' divinity and those conversations, as crucial, as important as they can be, as they are, as many of us, including myself, have framed our life around the idea that he is God, but to set those aside and just look at who he was. And part of what excites me about it is it means that those of you whose first impression of Jesus was less than ideal, it's a new way to give him a second chance to make a first impression. I think we can all relate to what happens when we make a poor first impression. And I think there's many of you in this room who, if we knew your story, we would collectively be amazed and proud of you for even being here. Because the first impression that you had of Jesus was not very good. It was given to you in some really difficult times. There was some really toxic things said. There was an environment that you just want nothing to do with. And so rather than ask you to consider the deep theological things about his nature, and we do that a lot around here, we thought, let's just look at his person. And let's just move towards Christmas by paying attention to who Jesus was. So last week we talked about the value and dignity he brought to individuals. This week I want to talk about, and it's kind of just going one concentric circle deeper, I suppose, getting a little more specific. This week I want to talk about the way Jesus interacted with women. And in fact, before I jump into this, because, listen, I'm a dude, and I understand I'm a chauvinist, but I don't try to be a chauvinist. I've arrived at it honestly. And so let me just kind of see if I can set the stage here. First of all, I want it to be safe to be a guy. Because it's not always safe to be a part of these conversations and be the dude in the conversation. I also want to kind of challenge all of us to look at the way Jesus interacted with women and to see if there aren't some finer points or broader points in our own life, in our own leadership, in our own marriage, in our own relating, in our own web surfing habits, for crying out loud, to see if maybe we wouldn't do well to think about whether or not we interact with women and treat women the way Jesus did 2,000 years ago. And so one way to do that would be to look at two numbers. The numbers 140 and the number 100. Now, at the time Jesus was born, we talked last week about how when Jesus came out of the chute, so to speak, I don't know why I'm so amused by that phrase, probably because I don't have a chute that babies come out of, and so it'd probably be less amusing to me if I did. Some of you are like, there's nothing funny about that. Trust me, it's not a chute. But when Jesus' feet hit the ground, he arrived in a world where people were commodities, and we talked about that. Well, when Jesus' feet hit the ground, so to speak, he arrived in a world where for every 140 men, there were 100 women. And the question, of course, becomes what happened? Now, when I was thinking about that this week, I was amused because, you may or may not know this, my wife is an OB nurse, which labor and delivery nurse, which means that my children know far more about human reproductive things than most adult men. It's always been a passion of hers. I think medical people, I've noticed there's a common theme where, like, you don't like slang terms, like it's not a unit, it's a penis, right? And they're not balls, they're testicles, and they're anybody uncomfortable yet? They're not boobs, they're breasts. Like, it's very much the culture of our home. And she has this passion that she doesn't want sexuality in particular to be this great mystery for them. So they are educated, quite educated. In fact, we were sitting at the dinner table a couple of weeks ago, and I don't even know how this came up, because this is what happens in our, like, this wouldn't be normal conversation, but the question was asked, what's a cervix? Now, I would hate to pull men and ask you what a cervix was, but my children know so well that one of my kids just needed hand motions. He just went, and if that doesn't make sense, it's because, you see, they know more than you do on this topic. And then one of them was telling a story how what he learned in school was that there was a king in England who his wives kept giving him daughters, and so he was having his wives killed. And so it's just like off with their head, off with their head, off with their head. And kind of just trying to lighten the mood a little bit, I said, well, that's ironic because he actually determined the gender of the babies, which caused the boys to go, like, wait a minute, so dads pick what gender the baby's going to be? Which I would have been perfectly okay with saying yes to that question, like, yep, that's how that works, dads pick. And Teresa had to explain all of this, and there's X chromosomes and Y chromosomes, and sperm came up at the table. In fact, did you know that that's actually what you're looking at? It is an X chromosome and a Y chromosome? Kind of crazy, isn't it? And I was actually thinking, I'm guessing that you can see why they call them that, because you can kind of see some shapes there. So just so you know, there's a giant picture of sperm on the screen. So she's explaining all this to the boys, and so I made this. I was like, so that means my sperm determines your gender. And one of the boys was like, could we please stop talking about dad's sperm at the dinner table? There are some advantages to like 12 and 10 and 9-year-old boys. We get to have a lot of fun on those. So, of course, the question, what happened, is it wasn't natural. That's completely lopsided. What happened was that the missing babies were born the wrong gender. And that's the reality of these times. This isn't a religion thing. This isn't a culture thing. This is just a thing. It happened. In fact, there's this letter that's been unearthed from a Roman military man writing back to his pregnant wife. Look at this. This just kind of captures it in all of its... He says, I ask and beg of you to take good care of our baby son. If you're delivered of a child, notice, like, if you're delivered, like it just happens. If you're delivered of a child before I come home, if it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, discard it. And then actually the letter just kind of continues to talk about, like, who's going to win the football game on Sunday. I mean, it's just this completely casual thing. This was what was normal. Romulus, who was prominent in Rome, Romulus actually issued a rule that every healthy son had to be raised, but only the first healthy daughter. And of course, we talked last week that in this culture, children had no value. We'll kind of talk a little bit more about that this morning. This wasn't about because, there's a disproportionate ratio of their value. It had to do with things like government and how do you sustain a common economy and how do you raise an army. And so there was this strong admonition, no, we need all the boys, but the girls, we can do without most of them. Posidippus, who, if you say it fast enough, you can pretend like you know how to pronounce it. Because there's nothing awkward about the name at all. He said this. He was a Greek poet. He said, everyone raises a son, even if he is poor, but exposes a daughter, even if he is rich. So this is Jesus' world. Now, enter into that conversation is the fact that, did you know that the longest conversation Jesus had with another person in the Gospels, the longest recorded conversation, which probably shouldn't be confused for the longest conversation he had with another person, because we don't know that. What we do know is that decades later, when these men who knew Jesus personally were compiling these stories of his life, the longest story of an interaction between Jesus and another person is found in John chapter 4. And it's found in the context. Remember when you grew up, there was always that, there was the corner lot with the dude who hadn't painted his house in 40 years, and your dad told you, don't go on his lot because he'll shoot you or he'll yell at you, and it was kind of scary, but if you cut across his lot, you could get to your buddy's house faster. Remember that? Or you could get to school faster. That was Samaria in Jesus' world. There was this giant chunk of land between the Galilee, where he spent most of his life, and Jerusalem, where you would go for religious reasons. And to get there, the most direct route was through Samaria, but they tried to avoid that. Jesus constantly cut through the yard, and he just kind of outran the rotten apples that were thrown at him. In fact, in John 4, we pick up kind of actually where we left off last week a little bit. And in John 4, if you wanted to have a conversation about the fact that Jesus was not just God but also human, here would be a good place to start, in my view. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. And I love just how casually the gospel writers talk about Jesus' physical limitations. Like, geez, wow, he was tired. And so he said, hey, you guys go get some beverages or go get some food and I'll hang out here. And of course, it's while he's hanging out that someone shows up to collect water. In verse 7, when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? Now, what that means is that the longest recorded conversation Jesus has with another human in the Gospels is with a woman, which is a pretty loud statement if you know what I mean, especially historically, and there's others of those. Now, this woman, if you've spent much time at all in church, you've heard lots and lots of conversation about her because this interaction is frankly one of the more beautiful moments in all of the Gospels because we get such a vivid picture of the way Jesus interacted with people. And to be sure, there's some things we know. Jesus names that she's had 5 husbands and the man she's now living with is not her husband. What we don't know is why that's happened. We don't know whether her first husband died or whether he divorced her. But what we do know is that divorce in that culture was very rare. The other thing we know is that there is not a single historical record of a woman divorcing a man in this day. So we don't exactly know, so did her first husband die, or what happened to her second husband? We don't know how she got all the way to the 6th person that she's now living with. But what we do know is that it wasn't because she divorced. She's not Elizabeth Taylor, if you know what I mean. And I don't mean that to pick on her, but this isn't a woman who's just looking for sexual escapades. This is a woman who's experienced rejection. Whether it came about via death or it came about via a husband divorcing her, probably some combination of the two, we don't know. The other thing that we know is this woman is poor. And the reason we know this woman is poor and of a very low class status is because she was collecting water at noon. Now, first of all, respectable wives didn't collect water. They had slaves and concubines. They collected water for them. The other thing we know is you don't collect water at noon. This is like going for a run at noon in the middle of July. People stayed away. You went indoors. Things kind of shut down at that time of day, assuming, of course, we don't know exactly the time of year, but this would have been very atypical. This tells us something about this woman's situation. A, that she was poor and had to collect her own water, and B, that perhaps the situation was such that the only time that she could safely go collect water was when nobody else was there. So we know some things about her, but there's even more things we don't know about her. The other thing that we know is that men could have second and third and fourth and fifth wives, but the second and third and fourth and fifth wife had to be of a lower class. And of course, being divorced in this culture would have put you naturally in a lower class. Being a widow without any sons would have instantly put you in a lower class. It's possible that she had been a concubine on several occasions. But what's remarkable about this story, and I would just challenge you and beg you and encourage you to go read it in your chair time, get up 10 minutes early tomorrow and read just John 4, what you see is Jesus leaning into her story. You see Jesus affirming, wait a minute. I know your story. I know it's full of pain. I know it's full of rejection. And I want you to know God knows you. He values you. Jesus, he challenges her to reconsider her plans for living and think about them completely different in light of the kingdom of God that has just arrived. And part of her story that's often not told is the end. See, this story goes long. Let's check out verse 39. Many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did, she said. And then it continues. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. So check this out. Apparently, Jesus' interaction with this woman impacted her so much that she couldn't shut her mouth about Jesus, and she carried on, and eventually the town begged him to stick around, and he stayed 2 more days and continued to talk about the opportunities available in him. But when you stop and think about it, is it any wonder that this woman couldn't stop talking about Jesus? It seems more than likely that she'd never been treated by another man this way. See, this is just one instance where you see Jesus repeatedly plants these seeds of subversion within the cultural institutions of their day. In Jesus' day, a woman's value and identity was based solely upon the man that she was married to. I know it's hard to imagine such a day, but that's the way that it was. I heard a story about a guy who was a CEO for a very successful company, and his wife was from Oregon, and so they decided to go back to her house, back to her hometown for Thanksgiving. He was excited because he had a new Audi, and so he drove this 500-mile journey at 120 miles an hour and was excited when he got to Oregon and pulled up to the gas station because, guys can calculate exactly how far we can get on a single tank of gas. I don't like to do that, but some of you like to get it to the very last thing. And so he pulled up to the gas station and was reminded that in Oregon you don't get to pump your own gas. And so he kind of reluctantly handed his credit card to a middle-aged man who was the gas attendant and kind of annoyed, went inside of the gas station, milled around, As he figured it was about time to leave, he came back out and saw that his wife had actually left the car and was talking to this man. He didn't think much of it and was maybe, I don't know, just not very others present at the time, got in the driver's seat. Eventually the guy brought him the receipt. They drove off, and they were driving down the road to her sister's house. And his wife finally said, hey, you wouldn't believe it, but I went to high school with that guy. He's like, what guy? She's like, the gas station attendant guy. I went to prom with him. I dated him in high school. At that point, the husband was feeling a little threatened and maybe a little arrogant. And he said, well, geez, I'll bet you're thinking you're sure glad you married me, a CEO, or else you'd be married to a gas station attendant. And she smiled and she said, actually, I was thinking, man, if I'd have married him, he'd be a CEO and you'd probably be a gas station attendant. There's these cultural things, and Jesus pushes and he pushes and he pushes. Jesus invited women to become followers of his, to become a part of his community. And we can miss this in the narrative, but it shows up in Luke chapter 8. These are the types of verses that sometimes I don't even like making these observations because like you, I have a third party kind of help me go like, here's the context of this. And I go, well, then why do I even read the Bible? Because I don't have that context. But this is one of those that is so important when you understand the historicity of it all. Luke 8:1. After this, Jesus traveled from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him and also some women. Now let's just stop there. Because see, like we do road trips for work with people of the opposite sex. We did high school retreats where both guys and girls were there. This is normal for us. This is radical in this culture. Wives in this culture, respectable ones, didn't leave the house, let alone go on vacation with their husbands. They didn't travel. The thinking was that the most respectable women, they stay inside. And you know what was the evidence that you would have kind of obeyed those commands? You know what it was? It was how fair your skin was. Go back and read Song of Solomon, and you see there's a conversation about the skin tone. Because skin tone, the whiter it was, the higher up the class scale you were. Because it said you didn't have to go get your own water. You didn't have to go do your own shopping. You were of this very elite class. In this culture, when you went to Grand Street for a show, the roles of women, they were played by slaves, prostitutes, and men. Because women didn't leave the house. Jesus pushes against that. Jesus pushes. I was once at a bachelor party, and there was this conversation about, do guys tan, do they not tan, and do you tan before your wedding? And it was kind of hilarious, and I didn't know these conversations happened because I had a farmer's tan at my wedding. But there was all this there was almost this like uncomfortable, like, have you tanned? Have you tanned? Like all these macho men standing around a bonfire. And all of a sudden we looked up, and the groom-to-be had his back to the fire and was staring at the stars. Like, did you guys see this? And there was someone who's like, wait a minute, you tanned, didn't you? That didn't happen in this culture. Women hung out in the house. Jesus said to women, hey, you can be part of this community. Not like as the cooks. Like, you can be a part of it. And the story continues. Women who had, also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Johanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Did you catch that? One of the women who followed Jesus was the wife of one of Herod's right-hand men, a.k.a. the nemesis of Jesus, had one of his dudes' wives who was a follower of Jesus, and it gets even better than that. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. Not only were women a part of it, they foot the bills, they paid the bills, and Jesus wasn't threatened by it. Jesus says to these women, come on. Yeah, come follow me. But I've never left my house. I've never left town. Come on. Let's do this. The other aspect of this that we can talk about is in the ancient world, bearing children was women's highest calling. Like that was your purpose in life. In Sparta, we have historical record in Sparta were slaves and prostitutes who gave birth, servants who gave birth to babies. If they gave birth to a male baby, they were given twice the food rations as if they gave birth to a female baby. Jesus one time is teaching, and this woman, understanding this culture, she screams out in verse 11:27, as Jesus was saying these things, a woman in the crowd called out, "Blessed is the mother who gave you birth and nursed you." And you expect Jesus to go, "My mom's the greatest, isn't she great? She's a virgin, you know." Listen to what he says. Blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and obey it. He's like, no, I'm not playing that game. And what you don't see in the Gospels is him in any way denying that being a parent is a noble calling. But you very much see Jesus pushing against a system that's really not unlike our kind of quiet, implied systems today that would say a woman without a baby has not experienced life in all of its totality. A woman who's not married is incomplete. Jesus goes like, it's a noble calling. But you can follow. He is not playing along by saying that his wife's sole purpose in life is the fact that his mother's sole purpose in life is that she gave birth to him, his wife. Wow, we could start a conversation there, couldn't we? John Ortberg, to whom I'm indebted for a lot of this historical research, he's just compiled this remarkable book called Who is This Man? Listen to the way he says this. He says, because they share a common humanity, the highest calling of a woman is also the highest calling of a man. The glorious adventure of coming to know and do the will of God in whose image they are created. Jesus pushes against marriage and the suggestion that there were these cultural norms in marriage. See, a woman, for better and for worse, was always under the life and death control of a man. A married woman, whether it be her husband or her owner, because a married slave could still have an owner. A daughter, whether it be her dad or her husband, a woman never left control of her husband. In fact, one thing that illustrates this is Caesar Augustus had this crazy idea. He said, okay, after a woman has given birth to 4 kids, then she's no longer under the control of a man, but not before then, and that was radical. This speaks to beliefs, where a woman lived, what they did, how their money was spent, what they believed about God or the gods, all determined by the man. And the man that determined that was the man who had manus. Now, manus is a Latin word that means hand. And it actually has trickled into our culture. You may have heard someone speaking of marriage, and sometimes we'll say, like, he asked for her hand in marriage. Well, in Rome, a bride could be given either with or without hand. If she was given with hand, that meant the father or the servant or the slave owner or whatever, the slave owner or the master, the father was giving the woman in marriage, which says something in its own right? Like giving the woman, because she's a possession. If he's giving her with hand, that means he is laying down his control over her and giving that to her husband. If he's giving her without hand, that means that he's giving her as a wife, but the father, the servant, or the owner, the master, is retaining rights of where you're going to live and what are you going to do and how you're going to spend your money, and namely, what are you going to believe? Jesus pushes against this. There's a story that involves 2 sisters, a woman named Martha and her sister Mary. Jesus ends up at their house. They're hanging out. Martha's back in the kitchen preparing lasagna. Her rebellious little sister is kind of hanging out in the living room, and she gets ticked. Martha gets mad about all this. And she comes to Jesus, verse 39. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. So, she's like, I'm not making lasagna. I don't even like lasagna, and it's not going to be vegetarian, so I don't want anything to do with it. Verse 40 says, but Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister's left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. To which you expect Jesus to go, yeah, woman, get in there. And he doesn't. He says, much like the Brady Bunch, Martha, Martha, the Lord answered. You're worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed. Or indeed only one. Mary's chosen what is better, and it'll not be taken away from her. I've done this too, especially as a youth pastor, but sometimes we talk about this passage as though the issue here is busyness, preoccupation. That Martha needs to understand that you had a couple options here and you chose the wrong one. It's not what they would have understood in the first century. That phrase, sitting at Jesus' feet, that's very technical speak for a disciple. In fact, there's a guy named Thomas who elsewhere in the Gospels, Jesus says to Thomas, I saw you sitting under the fig tree. And sometimes we think what, playing checkers? What was he doing? Checking his stream on Facebook? What was he doing under the tree? No, sitting under a tree, again, it's technical language for being a student of a rabbi. When Mary chose to sit at Jesus' feet, she was embracing something radically offered to her by Jesus. That was the right to be her own woman as it relates to her relationship with God. Jesus calls out something and he says, no, let's get this straight. There is something higher than any government or any man over a woman. It's God. Women were the only people who had the courage to go with Jesus to the cross. Men ran. They were afraid. At the resurrection, only women were there to witness it. They were the first witnesses for sure. And this is radical because in this day, women didn't, their testimony meant very little. One guy read, he compared it to the testimony of a minor in our culture today. Like, yeah, if it's the only thing you got, you probably better put him on the stand, but don't put much on it because it's not going to have much credibility. Women in Jesus' story were the first ones there. And there's a philosopher who was very anti the historical resurrection from ancient Greece. Listen to the way he says it. This kind of captures how little credibility women had. He says, but who saw this? A hysterical female, because they're always emotional. It's him, not me. A hysterical female, as you say, and perhaps someone other of those who were deluded by the same sorcery. It's like the most chauvinistic thing you've ever heard, right? And it's no wonder that his nose is broken. This was the attitude towards women. And of course, the question that I'm trying to beg is what happened? What happened that you kind of go like, what do you mean? They didn't think they even had to raise daughters? Like, what changed there? One historian says it this way. He says, it was where the church spread in early centuries after Jesus that girls ceased as a matter of routine, being disposed of at birth and being enslaved and exploited in childhood. Here's my one agenda this morning. Could it be that the reason why everything that they believed is so foreign to you is because this Jewish rabbi who lived a pretty short life, didn't write anything, didn't build anything, left no monuments of himself, this Jewish rabbi who lived 2,000 years ago, that he made decisions in his interactions with women, he treated women in such a way, and the ripples of those decisions and interactions are still catching up to us. The tricky thing about this conversation as a man is there's kind of no winning. Because I, like probably most men in this room, am well aware of the fact that I've inherited subtle powers and privileges that I take for granted because of my gender. In marriage, it's been the biggest thing that Teresa and I have had to work through. We did a series 2 summers ago called One But Separate. And that was not just academic. It was this very difficult realization to wait a minute. Like, separateness in marriage can be healthy. Like, marriage should not be confused with ownership. This is tough stuff. Really, I think my one agenda this morning is to say, despite all of our advancements and all of our personal growth and all of our social growth and cultural growth, and I'm not for a second claiming like anyone else that we've arrived at some kind of ideal place with gender equality, but would it do us well to admit that 2,000 years later, we're still trying to catch up with Jesus? That 2,000 years later, there was this historical person named Jesus who treated women in ways that in many ways would still be radical today. Who started a movement who said, you know what, you can follow me. This doesn't have to be determined for you. You know that Paul, when he planted churches in the New Testament, roughly half of them, according to the New Testament, were actually led by women? Could it be that 2,000 years later, we're still struggling to interact with and treat women the way Jesus did? Now, here's the trick of all this for me is we're having a conversation where we go, let's consider his historic merits. And if that's where you're at, Kate summarized it well for me when she said last week, I was just excited that this was her response. She said, I left last Sunday thinking, Jesus is a legend. Which is Aussie speak. Like, us Americans go, well, he's freaking awesome. And much more collected in its, he's a legend. I hope if you're someone who can't quite embrace Jesus as God and not sure you ever will, I hope there's a challenge there. If you're a Christ follower, here's the danger of this series. In my view, the danger would be that we would leave here and decide we're just going to try harder, which would honor God and it would honor grace, but it will also set us up for disappointment. Because Jesus doesn't say, hey, I'm going to do this, and then you're going to work really hard and make it possible. That's only half the story. I don't know about you, but I'm repeatedly reminded of my inability to live up to the standards that I want to live up to. Which leaves us the only other hope, which is grace. A God who goes, you try hard, and my grace will empower. Listen, I don't know where this leaves you. I hope you'll take the challenge to start your your Monday and your Tuesday and your Wednesday and your Thursday and your Friday by getting up 10 minutes earlier and grabbing the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Luke and just reading a few different paragraphs, maybe a chapter, and just slowly work your way through who Jesus was and how he treated people. Because the gospel is, that'll motivate you, and then you'll try, and then you realize you can't, and then you have a decision to make. How do I actually do this? I like to pray, and we're going to sing. God, it is astounding who you are, the fingerprints that you left. It's remarkable. And Jesus, I pray, if nothing else, that as we celebrate Christmas on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day with our families, that there would be this refreshed, renewed realization that you didn't just die. You completely changed the way people view people. You took the watermark and set it exponentially higher. God, I pray that you would give us contrite, humble hearts who work hard and acknowledge when we fall short. Jesus, I pray for the marriages and the families in this room and the friendships and the roommates and the companies and the organizations, that at the end, if nothing else, we would have grown in our ability to value people the way you do. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.